My name is Nick. I am a software engineer. I've been doing software and 3D and graphics and all that good stuff for damn near 7 years now. Started off doing OS work, low-level graphic stuff, moved on to really interesting projects. I didn't even know people were seriously like doing 3D and gaming in the web. And from there, ended up working as a engine programmer at Riot Games for a little bit on Val. And now we come to my next step in my journey where I started my own game studio, Cantankerous Creations. Started that up a couple months ago. Figured, you know what, the way that the industry's looking right now, we might as well try to see what we can do on our own.
I mean, that's kind of interesting with all the layoffs and stuff like that. Talk about the whole process of like creating your own studio and then the experiences of working with Riot and all the stuff you did.
Yeah, working at Riot. Riot's a really interesting place. It's full of a lot of smart people. And it's interesting because working there, I learned a lot about how studios work at scale.
Hmm.
So, it's one thing to have like, one person working on one game. And there's been plenty of examples of folks who managed to be very successful doing that.
Hmm.
But that's always the exception and not necessarily the rule.
Right.
It's possible to make a livable wage, being a solo indie dev, definitely possible. It's possible, it's just not likely. So, temper your expectations if you do want to go that route. But with Riot, you have, thousands of people working together to support like certain games. Like for
Hmm.
instance, working on Val, you have damn near 1,000 people, doing all sorts of like what goes into that end product that you play.
Hmm.
Not just the folks who work on the gameplay programming, not just the folks who work on the engine. There's also folks who just make sure that the build machines are running. There's folks who make sure that the internet in the office is working, that
Hmm.
there's food in the kitchen. And of course, you have like your artists, your concept artists, your art direction. Like if you want to do voice acting in the game, then you might need like a voice director. Of course, you're gonna need to hire a voice actor. It's like the more that you want to do, the harder it gets. The more people that you need to help with all the different parts of the life cycle. So it's cool just seeing just how that happens at AAA scale, where you might be working on a feature for weeks at a time.
Hmm.
Like I remember
Yeah.
seeing like rounds of revision and testing and all that just to get a setting in the settings menu out to players. It's
Yeah.
just like you got to make sure that one, you're not going to ruin your player's experience with stuff that hasn't gone through rigorous testing,
Hmm.
and two, that you make sure that everything you release is of quality for your studio. So
Yeah.
a lot of stuff gets lost on the cutting room floor. There's a lot of
Yeah.
cool ideas that just don't make it to players because the bar is that high. On the flip, when you go indie, the bar is wherever you want to set it. And that's freeing for a lot of people.
Now that you have that experience, seeing what that looks like on a grand scale, what you're kind of doing now, how is that sort of balance? Do you think it's easier? Do you think it's a little bit more difficult? Kind of how do you approach
I think it's easy in the sense of I am responsible for the vision of my game. And the more people I bring into the fold, the less direct control you really have over that vision. And that could be okay. Like, like say I'm not like, a skilled 2D artist. And so I'm okay with giving up parts of that creative vision to folks who have that expertise that I trust. The problem is that, the more that you want to do, the harder it is to execute on that vision that you have. And so let's say you want to make a science-based dragon MMO and you're like a one-man team. Well, you're not going to have a good time because just getting a game up to the fact to where you can have, tens of thousands of players in a single shard is mind-blowing the amount of work that goes into it. Like even it's interesting. It's a balancing act of what can I do? How long does it take for me to do that? As well as how long can I work for and how much can I afford to do in parallel or,
it? Yeah.
hire folks to do alongside me. And
Right.
that's where the trick of making a successful studio is it comes into. And we will find out if I'm able to do that.
Well, you say you're a software engineer. Where did you even get your start before you even got to Riot? How did you even get that opportunity?
Yeah, that's a great question. Aspiring folks with no industry experience and no software experience. I started off in high school making video games for a TI-84 calculator. Like I use basic. I manually programmed the pixels to turn on and turn off whenever I needed like certain, like a sprite to show up in a certain location. And there are games written using like, the most rudimentary of tools that absolutely fucking slap. That's the magic of game dev, where it's like, yeah, if you want to make games, go make games. Like, go do what you can within your ability. There's tools where if you don't know a lick of code, you can spin up a game using like, preset behaviors and stuff like that. You can still make something fun. I started with rudimentary tools, and eventually I actually went to a 4-year university, got my bachelor's in computer engineering. Learned a little bit of circuits along the way. A lot of fun. And from there, did a lot of internships. Interned at a lot of different companies. Cisco, doing networking. Went to Philips, doing like software for healthcare machines, like the UI software. It turns out a lot of those concepts translate over to game dev, or indirectly. But I snuck in like a 3D renderer into their front end because it's like, hey, it had the capability of rendering 3D models. Why not? From there, I think what really kickstarted my career, I worked at Microsoft for a bit right out of college. And from there, it's like, one, the network just blows wide open because you meet people from all over the country who come there to work. And two, the bar it's high. That doesn't mean it's not achievable. As long as you try, as long as you know what you're doing and you know the fundamentals of software development and algorithms, programming, and just software engineering and just how you architect things, that's like the core skills that you build to get to a lot of these like large companies. But the magic about game dev is that it doesn't matter what language you learn because there's tools for a lot of different languages to make cool stuff. Like Minecraft was written in Java. Most game programming is in C++ these days, or at least if you want to use like industry standard tools, Unreal Engine using C++. Want to use Unity, that's C sharp, but the actual energy of Unity was written in C++ as well, and so it's hard to get away from C++. But if you don't want to learn it, you can still get around that.
As far as where you started, how has that journey been kind of riding that wave?
That's a really good question. First and foremost, like the tools you use help you do stuff better. Almost always. With better tools, you can do things. You can achieve more with the same amount of effort. How that translates into like video games, where it's like, 10, 20 years ago, it would be really hard to make like a sprawling terrain full of procedurally generated like, villages and cities and cliff sides and mountains and stuff. But these days, folks have put in the effort to create tools that, have allow you to do things like that. A good example of this would be Minecraft. We can always go back to Minecraft. So like if you go into a Minecraft world, you start in like, the area with trees and leaves and stuff, but there's desert spawn, there's oceans, there's mountains, there's valleys, and a lot of the world generation for that had to be written like, for the game. And so, but these days, let's say you wanted to make a game in Unreal Engine, you get terrain generation tools. Like you can just paint, if you could figure out a way to generate your map where it's like, oh, I want this part of the map to be desert, I want this part to be ice, I want this part to be land, and just given like an image of where you want your regions laid out, you can procedurally generate like what content will fill that region. So like, let's say you create like a pattern of like, this is a house that I want generated, these are trees I want there, and maybe you set up the rules for how you want these, like the frequency and patterns for how you want these things to generate. But like you have so much more ability to create this stuff without needing to go through the trouble of understanding everything about procedural world generation tools. That's where things get pretty crazy. In addition, of course, we can't have this discussion while talking about AI generation tools. It's incredible that nowadays you can go to an image generator and ask it to give you concept art. Like, let's say you have a pitch for a game that you want to create, you can go to image generation tools and get ideas to, like, sell that idea of the game you want to make. You can generate something that looks like the kind of protagonist you want to put in your game. You can get, concept art for the kind of cities that you want, and you can sell that idea without going through the trouble of, creating it and hiring a concept artist. Um, that said, it's really hard to get what you want out of those things.
What does that look like for you as far as being a creator? Having a studio, obviously, this is going to continue down a path. I mean, who knows where it's going to end up, but obviously, this is going to continue. What does that look like for you? Like, how do you juggle the whole? I need to find tools that obviously are going to help me improve what I'm doing while also trying to stay on the ethical side of the spectrum.
That is a really good question. And I already know, like, studios that want to make sure that their use of trained models is above board. Like, they're all asking themselves how to go about this, how I can safely use these tools. One, I would I would make sure that, like, anything that I ship to players is, like, authored by me or somebody that, it's either authored or I clearly know the licensing of it, that I can freely use it, and that I know the chain of where did this art come from. So that'd be like if I wanted to, gray box out a level and I use a bunch of AI generated content. That could be great for, getting the feel of what you want. I could gen, models that, I use as stand-ins for houses. I could gen, characters, gen animations. And then once it comes time to where are my production assets, that's when it's time to go back and then you start to make sure that you're using either, properly licensed stuff or, you're creating it yourself. So that could be great where it's like, hey man, I just want to like create like a fighting game. Let me gen up like some character looking things. Maybe I figure out a way to generate the sprite sheets just so I have something to put together where I can it looks like a game, it feels like a game, I can play it like a game, and I can fine tune, as a engineer, my priority is like making sure all the gameplay and everything works as I expect it to. Then I can worry about, getting my production assets later. But I can quickly get to something where it's like, hey, this is a prototype that's shareable that I can, get some feedback on, and folks aren't just like, hey, why is everything gray? It looks ugly.
Working with Riot, what did you say you worked on when you were there?
Yeah, so I work primarily with the game Valorant.
Like, what did you kind of work on with that? How was that? Obviously, it's a huge title, so kind of the day to day kind of working with it.
Yeah, so I worked on the engine team for Valorant. It's easy to have be an artist on the game, and you work on a model, and your model goes into the game. And you're like, hey, there's the model I made. Meanwhile, on my side, I'm like, be like, you see that dragon there? Yeah, like the folks who tried to make that dragon came to me because it looked terrible originally, and I gave them some ways to fix it up and make it actually work the way they wanted to, and that's what I help make happen. That crash whenever you try to like drop and pick up your guns quickly. Yeah, it turns out it was a reason. It was an issue with the way that we loaded the assets. So I was able to figure that out and fix it. So you can thank me for having your game crash less while you're in game. The cool thing about that is like on the day to day, it's like it was anything from like discrete issues, like those were two like actual issues that other teams that came to us was like, hey, we tried to figure this out, it's an issue with Unreal, can you guys dive in there and figure out what it is and fix it. We had like systemic change that we want to do where it's like, oh, how do we reduce like the install size on your computer, like how can we figure out like make sure that we're not shipping pre-release content. How can we make sure that like how can we upgrade the game so that it uses the latest version of Unreal Engine. uh my prayers go out to the folks who are still solving that issue for Valorant. I hope y'all are doing well. But there's long term big stuff like that where it's like how do we systemically improve the game, and then there's also the day to day of like this is on fire, please help us, where we help other folks with solve their problems.
What do you have plans to work on? What type of games do you see yourself kind of making? Give some insights of what you kind of got going on your own.
Yeah, so I'm currently working on I might as well say working on an arena fighter game. So growing up, I always loved like the anime brawler games. Like you got your Naruto, Ultimate Ninja games, Budokai. fighter light type games where like there's still that active decision making of playing a fighting game, but a lot of these games are toned down to be a lot more accessible for folks.
Mhm.
There's less emphasis on combos, and there's less emphasis on like just being like precise, but
Right.
more, but you still have to understand the game state, you still have to react, you still have to know how your options and what works when.
Mhm.
And one game that really like I absolutely fell in love with was Armored Core. If you've ever played multiplayer in Armored Core, it is an adrenaline rush
Mhm.
because it's almost like a fighting game where it's like, you have to manage your ammo, you have to aim at the opponent, you got to make sure that you know how much boost you still have. If you run out of burst, a dude might hit you with a rocket and then you're in trouble. And I feel like there's like a liminal space where we can try to marry like those ideas of like how do we make a cool arena battling game that also incorporates like cool mech. It's like maybe the mech stuff drives like the movement, and the arena fighting drives like what abilities you have.
Hmm.
And still figuring it out, but I love mechs.
What kind of projects you work on kind of at one time, whether you just kind of hunker down on one or you just kind of split off and do kind of your thing. But how do you go about doing the stuff you kind of want to do, obviously, versus the things that is sort of in the space that people are actually, you need people to play the game, obviously. How do you go about determining, I want to do this, or do you just say, hey, I'm just going to make games that I like playing and, we're going to see what kind of comes of that?
So I know some folks go by the adage of find the fun,
Hmm.
where your top priority at the end of the day is to create something that's fun.
Yeah.
And I respect that notion a lot. And I think that leads to a lot of really cool novel games.
Right.
Um, on the flip side, I'm, not only trying to get, create a game, I also got a company I'm trying to stand up. So sometimes you have to like eat your vegetables and, instead of spending the day messing around with like character movement, maybe you're doing your taxes. Maybe you're
Yeah.
making sure that you're not violating county law, report your earnings.
And that's just another piece of it that goes along with the total package of creating your own studio.
Hmm,
When you were at a place like Riot, you didn't have to worry about what they was doing with the taxes. I mean, they already had somebody that was doing that sort of stuff. Whereas now it's your thing, so you got to worry about the very basic
exactly.
X's and O's and zeros and ones.
But yeah, the whole business side of stuff. I'm sure plenty of developers struggle when they realize, wait, I am the business. How do I figure this out? And some really good advice I've gotten from a life coach is like, whatever you really don't want to do, like either you find a way to do it anyways, or you pay someone to do it.
What do you see yourself like here, like in the 5 to 10 year range? Like, what does it look like? Are you trying to expand? Are you trying to just like get out some ship game? What's the kind of way you feel like you want to move forward with your company?
That is a really good question. And I feel like going when you strike it out like solo with self-funding, you have to figure out like what's your runway and what's your plan afterwards. And so currently for me, yeah, I have a decent amount of runway. Thankfully, working as a professional software engineer is pretty lucrative.
Yeah.
So like, highly recommend for folks considering it. Even though the industry is kind of weird, working with large companies can be weird. A lot of money to be made.
Yeah.
There's a lot of money to be made. If this game idea turns out to be something that I'm passionate about and something that I feel resonates with the audience that I, created for, then by all means, like I would love to see this, reach as many players as possible. And, you figure out how large of a team do you need to help deliver that vision. So in the short term, we're just like, hey, what can we solo dev? What can we contract? What can we put together to get folks interested in? And if it's not interesting, then you figure out how to pivot. Be that,
Yeah.
go find another lucrative opportunity, or you find another idea you want to iterate on.
What is the timetable as far as the game that you're working on? I'm sure you got some deadlines, self-imposed deadlines. Like what you thinking about as far as your game?
Thankfully, I spent like 2 weeks just kind of planning out like what are all the features I feel I need in this game to call it like complete, and what are the different stages of completeness that I'm, tying each to. So, what do I need to get to a prototype? How long do I think this prototype's going to take? It might take a couple months. And once you get to that prototype stage and you have a shareable build of the game, that's when you start gathering feedback and you start, drumming up that kind of buzz. I've seen some developers where they were able to organically grow their audience through sharing their development process on like YouTube or what have you, and that's a really interesting thing that I'm still considering. Still considering, but like in the short term, it's like even more work that distracts you from the core game, and in the long term, maybe you figure out a way to market your game yourself. So there's trade offs to everything you want to do. From there, it's like if you have a prototype and you want to keep going to the next stage of, we'll call it like an alpha, and that's when your game is starting to look like, something playable and shippable to players. That's great. And then once you iterate on that, you go even further. What's like, I guess nowadays we call it the beta. What's
Mhm.
something that's looking even closer to completion to your full vision of something that you want to sell to your players, and then eventually you get to your full release. And I've tried to gate that reasonably like meaningfully, where the prototype is more like what's the bare minimum I need to sell this promise of the game. If
Yeah.
it's a fighting game, maybe it's 2 characters, maybe it's even 1 character.
How do you determine whether or not where you're gonna release it on console, you PC? How do you kind of go about that?
That's another great question. These days it is so much easier to release a game on a game or on mobile platforms
Hmm.
than it is to release it on a console. I've done Android iOS development before, and it can be a pain. But compare that to the difficulty of getting like a console SDK. Like I previously on a previous project, I worked with somebody, Parkour Posse. It's in stores now. Try it out. We wanted to simul ship on Switch, but Nintendo didn't even want to give us an SDK because it's like, yo, man, if you don't even have a game under your name, don't talk to us. That's the same thing with a lot of platform holders where it's like, they have the responsibility of making sure that, the stuff in their store is up to the quality they want. And so, they will it's sometimes it can be hard to get onto those platforms. And that's why these days, if you're looking to do like a multi-plat game, just target PC first, then port. If you don't have the funding to direct, develop and port like simultaneously, it's way easier to one like marketing and branding and all that's easier if you already have something that's out already because the way that SEO works, the way that people work, it's like nobody likes something that they've seen for the first time. But if they've seen your stuff before and they see another thing from you and another thing, and they're like, I know that guy.
When you got that job and kind of what you're doing now, obviously, if you're working on something that if you don't necessarily feel like doing it or you feel like somebody else can do it at a higher quality, you would just hire somebody to do it. How do you determine that? It's your vision, it's your game, but how do you go about determining whether or not, hey, I would rather just have somebody do this so I can focus on this, or no, this is kind of something I'm gonna keep close to the vest because I don't necessarily want, my idea to kind of get hijacked in a way.
That is a really good question, and I'm a little concerned I haven't asked myself that before. But ultimately, when you hire somebody, there's always going to be risk. There's always going to be risk. But the best you can do as, like the employer or, in most small studios case, the contractor is like make sure that the terms of which like you want this work to be done is clear. Let's say if you can clarify what your expectations are, like say hiring somebody to make a feature, can you clearly describe, like, can you give somebody a one page that describes the feature, what you want implemented, what the expectations are, what's like, the validation that you need on it? Then on the flip side, let's say if I had like a unit of work that I wanted somebody to do for me, be clear of like, hey, this is how much I'm willing to pay for it. Does this work for you? If not, you come to negotiation about the pay rate and the contract length and all that. And it's just as long as everyone's on the same page, it's hard to walk away from an agreement that's like everyone's in alignment with.
Right.
Problems happen where it's like let's say work doesn't go meet like the standard that's expected. That's when you go back to that original agreement. It's like, hey man, I asked for this, this, and that. We didn't get this, this, and that. And as long as you can clearly go back to what was originally agreed upon, that's where it's I would say a reasonable person can come to terms on that. But as far as like, how do you know you found the right person? Don't know. And I feel like a lot of that also goes back to, what's prior work. So let's say like if I was looking at an artist that I love their work for and I wanted to hire them, there it is, their portfolio did that hiring. When it comes to like software, that is all over the place. And that's where, the terms of your contract, that's really what kind of helps you as, the contractor be able to either exit if you miss like, if like you whoever you're working with missed a critical milestone, um, or, you make sure that what work that you're paying for gets done, or you have, like terms of what happens when it doesn't get done.
I'll let you sign off. Plug yourself and yeah, just let us know.
Yeah, I'm Nick. You can find me on a lot of stuff by the name Nicklowbar. That's usually what I go by. Of course, just started up Cantankerous Creations. That's the company. You can find, or we're going to spin up all the social media for Cantankerous Creations. Once I get the will and want to do a bunch of social media or find somebody to do that. Name of the game, Feral Gear. It's going to be cool. I'm excited about this because I've been toying around with this idea for years now. So it's cool that I finally have the time in my life to like try to execute.
Yeah, no,
Uh, yeah, if you like Pokemon, you like Mecha, we got a place for you. Check out the game. Find me on social media, and yeah, thanks for having me on here. This was really cool.